When a family in Alamogordo, New Mexico returned home from work, they were stunned by a sight they could hardly believe. Instead of finding their black Labrador curled up in his usual spot, they were shocked to discover a bobcat stretched out comfortably, taking over his soft dog bed. The wildcat had likely slipped into the house through an unlocked pet door and made itself at home while the owners were away. It was a young animal, thin, limping, looking like a desperate creature searching for shelter in the unforgiving desert. By the time officers from the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish arrived, the bobcat had already slipped back outside. Thankfully, neither the dog nor the family had been harmed. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would leave everyone speechless. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our unbelievable stories. That August in Alamogordo, New Mexico was scorching enough to set the whole town on fire. Eleanor Hayes stood silently at her kitchen window, eyes fixed on the thermometer mounted on the porch. The needle had climbed past 108 degrees Fahrenheit. At 71, she was no stranger to the harsh rhythm of the desert, but this summer carried a different kind of unease. It felt as though the wildlife around them was growing desperate, more reckless than ever, ready to cross the line that usually kept them apart from humans. "Frank," she called toward the living room, where her husband was bent over their old air conditioner. "We should put out a few more buckets of water. Yesterday I saw some coyotes, skin and bones, their eyes red with thirst." Frank Hayes, a retired construction supervisor, nodded. At 74, his knees ached with every change of weather, but his heart for animals was as warm as it had been that first afternoon Eleanor met him more than 50 years ago. Their old dog, a black Labrador named Shadow, lifted his graying head from the rug near the sliding door. At the mention of the struggling creatures outside, he gave only a faint wag of his tail, weary yet faithful. "I'll fill the water basin before we head to the clinic," Frank said, glancing at the clock on the wall. Eleanor's cardiology appointment was at 2 o'clock, and they wouldn't be back until evening. As they were about to leave, Eleanor hesitated by the sliding door. The little pet door they had installed for Shadow 5 years ago still worked perfectly, though their old dog rarely used it now because of his arthritis. She briefly considered locking it. There had been reports of wildlife sneaking into homes through pet doors, but Shadow was used to going in and out during the day, and in all these years they had never had any problems. "Ready?" Frank called, jangling the car keys in his hand. Eleanor nodded, leaning down to pat Shadow's back. "Sleep well, buddy. We'll be back before dinner." The house soon sank into silence, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and Shadow's soft, wheezy breathing. Outside, the New Mexico desert shimmered under rising heat waves, shadows shrinking as noon approached. And in that very moment, a figure appeared, slipping quietly through the brittle mesquite at the edge of the property. It was a young bobcat, maybe 2 years old, her mottled gray coat still vivid against the sun-scorched earth. But something was wrong. Her left hind leg bore the mark of an old injury, perhaps from a brutal fight over territory or a narrow escape from a pack of coyotes. The wound had healed, but it left her with a limp that made hunting harder and harder. In the unforgiving desert, even the smallest disadvantage could mean the difference between life and death. For weeks, she had been watching this house. At first, it was only the water basin Frank faithfully set out in the yard. But then she noticed other things. The slow, gentle old dog who rarely barked, the quiet, predictable routine of the elderly couple, and most of all, the cool air that spilled out every time the pet door swung open. At last, desperation and exhaustion overcame caution. The bobcat crept toward the house, her padded feet soundless on the scorching gravel. She paused at the pet door, ears tuned to every sound, her senses analyzing every trace of scent drifting through the opening. Shadow's smell was everywhere, but it wasn't threatening, only old and weary, like the scraggly mesquite scattered across the barren ground. She pressed gently against the flap, A rush of cool air poured over her, like a blessing. The tiled floor inside was icy against her burning paws. She stood still for a long moment, every muscle tense to bolt, her golden eyes sweeping the silent room. The house lay in silence, seemingly safe and untouched. Shadow lifted his head as the four-legged visitor slipped inside, their eyes meeting across the living room. In another life, under different circumstances, this might have been the scene of a fierce confrontation. But Shadow was old and seasoned, and the Bobcat was young and exhausted. They regarded each other with the wary respect of creatures long accustomed to the laws of survival. The Bobcat's gaze fell on Shadow's oversized bed, the one Eleanor had ordered online, laughing that it was far too much for a dog that barely weighed 70 pounds. The bed sat perfectly in the stream of cool air from the AC, soft and inviting. Shadow watched as she approached, his tired tail giving a single uncertain wag. The Bobcat circled the bed twice, her instincts battling against the weight of her exhaustion. At last, she leapt up, her claws snagging lightly in the plush fabric. It was the softest surface she had ever known, softer than the warm sand where she sometimes rested, softer than the rare patches of dried grass she occasionally found. She turned in a circle once, then again, before sinking down with a deep, weary sigh that seemed to rise from her very soul. Shadow lowered his head back to the rug, his eyes half closed. If this spotted stranger wanted to share his space, well, he was too old to object. Frank had shared his home with cats before, but never one this large. The Bobcat dozed fitfully, one ear constantly swiveling toward every sound, ready to spring away at the first hint of danger. But as the quiet minutes passed, her body began to relax for the first time in weeks of exhaustion. The cool air, the soft bed, the quiet safety of the house. It was a paradise she had never known existed. 3 hours later, when Eleanor and Frank returned home, the sight that greeted them would be etched into their memories for the rest of their lives. Frank saw her first. He stopped Eleanor as they stepped in from the garage, his hand trembling slightly on her arm. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. "Don't move." There on Shadow's big bed, surrounded by his old toys and familiar blanket, lay a wild bobcat, curled into a ball, her spotted coat rising and falling with peaceful breaths. Shadow sat nearby, his tail wagging faintly as his owners came home, as if the presence of this strange guest was hardly worth bothering about. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. In all their years living in New Mexico, they had only ever seen bobcats fleetingly. Shadows on the desert's edge, brief glimpses of wild beauty. Never anything this close. But this was beyond imagination. "My phone," Eleanor whispered. "It's in my purse." With the caution of people seasoned by life, she carefully pulled out her phone and managed to snap a few photos. The bobcat's ears twitched at the soft click of the camera, but she didn't wake. "We need to call Game and Fish," Frank murmured, his voice dropping low as if afraid to disturb the sleeping creature. This can't be normal." Eleanor nodded, her fingers trembling as she dialed. The conversation with the dispatcher felt surreal. No, they weren't joking. Yes, there really was a bobcat lying in their dog's bed. No one was hurt. Yes, they were certain it was a bobcat and not just an oversized house cat. Officer David Morales arrived within 40 minutes, though to Eleanor and Frank, the wait felt like endless hours. They stood frozen in the kitchen, eyes locked on the predator, sleeping just a few steps away. Morales, a veteran with more than 20 years at the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, had seen his share of strange situations in his career. But even he paused, his heart skipping for a moment, when his eyes fell on the unbelievable scene before him. "Well," Morales murmured, "that's a first." He began explaining, his voice calm and measured, as if reciting a well-worn script. how they would need to carefully encourage the animal to leave, the dangers of wildlife entering homes, the diseases such creatures could carry. But even as his words hung in the air, something shifted in the living room. The bobcat's golden eyes snapped open, sharp and alert. She saw the humans, saw the man in uniform, and her body tensed instantly. But she didn't panic. With the fluid grace of a creature that had been in deep sleep only moments before, she rose, arched her back, and stretched the motion no different than that of an ordinary house cat, then padded silently toward the pet door. She paused at the threshold, glancing back one last time. Her distinctive black-tipped ears stood tall, etching the moment into human memory. Then she slipped outside, vanishing into the crimson glow of the New Mexico desert sunset. "Damn," Morales muttered. Then, remembering his role, he launched into the lecture. The need to keep pet doors securely locked, the absolute caution required when wildlife comes close to people, and the unseen dangers they may carry. Eleanor and Frank nodded along, but their minds were elsewhere, still reeling from the surreal encounter they had just experienced. That night, lying in bed, neither of them could sleep. "Frank," Eleanor whispered into the darkness, "did you see how thin she was?" "I did. And her leg." She was limping. "I know." They lay in silence for a long time, the only sound the desert wind whispering outside the window. Then Eleanor spoke again. Shadow didn't mind her. Frank sighed. He knew instantly where his wife's thoughts were going. After 50 years of marriage, he could read her mind as clearly as words carved across the star-filled night sky. "Ellie," he whispered, "I know Morales gave his warning, but she didn't do any harm. She was only looking for someplace cool and safe to rest. Do you remember the last time we saw the creek running? The last time real rain fell here?" Frank didn't answer, because they both already knew. This year's drought had been harsher than any they could remember, even by New Mexico's unforgiving standards. Wildlife all across the region was struggling to survive. The next morning, Eleanor found Frank in the garage, pulling out an old dog bed they had kept from Shadow's younger days. "What are you doing?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Nothing foolish," Frank replied, his calloused hands carefully fluffing the flattened cushion. "I just thought, maybe we could set this out on the porch, near the door, but not inside. If she comes back, I'm not saying she will, but if she does, at least she'd have a place to rest that isn't in the house." Eleanor smiled and leaned in to kiss his stubbled cheek. "I'll get a few more water bowls." And so they set up a small corner they would later jokingly call the Bobcat Motel. The old bed was placed just right, tucked in the shade but catching the breeze. A heavy ceramic bowl filled with fresh water, impossible to tip over. Everything was visible from the kitchen window, yet far enough from the door to feel safe. 2 days passed without a trace of her. Frank began to wonder if they were being foolish, two lonely retirees projecting human feelings onto a wild animal. But on the third morning, as dawn painted the distant mountains pink, Eleanor gripped her husband's hand as they stood at the window, sipping their coffee. The bobcat had returned. She circled the old bed with cautious suspicion, her golden eyes flashing in the pale morning light. She sniffed every inch, lifted her head to check the escape routes, tested the surface with one paw, and then, as if making a monumental decision, she lay down. Slowly, her body began to relax. "Don't get too attached," Frank warned. But his voice was soft, and Eleanor caught him reaching for the binoculars they kept on the windowsill. In the weeks that followed, a strange routine developed. The bobcat, whom Eleanor secretly named Luna, though she never once spoke it aloud, appeared every few days. Sometimes she would rest for hours. Other times, she stopped only long enough to drink and cool down. Shadow watched from inside, his old tail giving a faint wag whenever she appeared, and the bobcat seemed to accept his presence with astonishing ease. Eleanor began researching everything she could about bobcats, their territorial nature, their instinctive fear of humans, their demanding dietary needs. She even joined online forums for wildlife rehabilitators, carefully phrasing her questions as hypotheticals so no one would suspect. Frank installed a motion-activated camera on the porch, and in the evenings they would sit together watching the footage, like proud grandparents reviewing their own home movies. As September faded into October, and the brutal heat finally broke, Luna's visits became more frequent. Her body looked fuller. Her spotted gray coat shone with health. The limp was still there, but it no longer seemed to weigh her down the way it once had. Sometimes, in the early mornings or late evenings, they would see her batting at a stick or chasing after a drifting butterfly, moments that made her seem impossibly young and fragile despite her wild nature. The first time Luna and Shadow made contact, Eleanor nearly dropped her coffee cup. It was a cool November morning, and Frank had left the sliding door open to let in the crisp air. Shadow was sprawled in the doorway, half in and half out, when Luna appeared. Instead of stopping at the porch bed as she usually did, she walked straight toward Shadow. The two touched noses, a brief, delicate contact before Luna strolled past him and into the house. "Frank," Eleanor gasped, but he was already there, watching every step as the Bobcat padded to Shadow's indoor bed and lay down as naturally as if she had never left. "What do we do?" Eleanor whispered. "Nothing," Frank answered after a pause. "We do nothing. She knows the way out." That day marked a turning point. Luna began coming inside more often, though never when they were moving about. She seemed to know the rhythms of the house. Early mornings with their coffee, late evenings when they watched the news. Between her and Shadow, an odd sort of friendship began to grow, sometimes sharing the same bed, sometimes simply lying near each other in comfortable silence. Officer Morales would have been horrified if he had known, but Eleanor and Frank told no one. This was their secret, their small miracle blossoming in the harsh desert. Then January brought an unusual cold, and Luna started coming by almost every day. She was clearly gaining weight, her belly rounding in a way that made Eleanor and Frank exchange knowing looks. They had watched enough nature documentaries to recognize the signs. "She's pregnant," Eleanor whispered one evening, as they sat quietly watching Luna groom herself on Shadow's bed. Frank only nodded, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. "What should we do?" she asked. "What can we do? We can't put her out in this cold." They waited and watched, anxious like grandparents to be awaiting their first grandchild. Luna seemed to sense their concern. As her pregnancy advanced, she grew more cautious, yet she still came to the house, drawn by its safety and warmth. Then, it happened on a cold February night. They woke to soft, unfamiliar sounds drifting from the living room. Moving quietly, they peeked around the corner and found Luna in the throes of labor. Shadow sat nearby like a sentinel, alert but calm. For the next 2 hours, Eleanor and Frank stood silently, hearts tight with awe, as they witnessed Luna deliver 3 tiny kittens. It was a miraculous moment, instinctive, fierce, and heartbreakingly devoted. The newborns were impossibly small, blind, their mews fragile and thin, their spotted fur still wet and clinging to their delicate bodies. Eleanor clutched Frank's hand so tightly he later half-joked that she had left bruises. They quietly stepped back, giving Luna her space. But the motion-activated camera captured everything, every sacred second of it. For 3 weeks, Luna raised her kittens in their living room. Eleanor and Frank adjusted their entire lives around her rhythm, tiptoeing through their own home, speaking only in whispers and subtle gestures. Shadow appointed himself guardian, positioning his body between the little wild family and anyone who came to the door. Visitors Eleanor and Frank always turned away with one excuse or another. They watched the 3 kittens grow day by day, eyes opening, their first wobbly steps, their clumsy wrestling matches that looked more like play than battle. All of it unfolded under Shadow's patient, gentle gaze like that of a silent father. Luna proved to be an extraordinary mother, fierce yet devoted, teaching with sharp little swats and a deep purr that rumbled like a small engine. Then one morning they were gone. The bed lay empty. The house was quiet again. Eleanor broke down in tears, and Frank simply held her, unashamed of the bond they had formed with the Wild family that had brought magic into their home. "She did what she had to do," Frank whispered softly. "She needs to teach them how to live wild." In the months that followed, they caught glimpses of Luna now and then, a shadow slipping past the tree line, a fleeting image on the camera. But she never returned to the bed, never approached the house again as if she understood the chapter had closed. Shadow seemed to miss her most of all. He lay stretched out on his bed, sighing heavily, his brown eyes scanning the yard with quiet hope. Eleanor bought him new toys. Frank took him for slow walks, though his own joints ached with every step. But Shadow's vitality continued to fade, dwindling as summer returned. On a blazing July afternoon, nearly a year after Luna had first appeared, Shadow passed quietly in his sleep, his head resting on the bed where he had once first shared space with a wild bobcat. Eleanor and Frank buried Shadow beneath the old mesquite tree in their backyard. They wept without restraint, saying goodbye to the gentle friend who had bridged the fragile divide between the tame and the wild in the most graceful way. That afternoon, as they sat on the porch, letting themselves sink into the rare softness of the cooling air, a flicker of movement at the edge of the yard made them freeze. Luna emerged from the shadows, but she wasn't alone. 3 young bobcats followed close behind, lean but resilient, their coats patterned with the distinctive rosettes of their kind. Now, nearly grown, the family paused at the edge of the yard. 4 pairs of golden eyes glimmered in the dim porch light. Luna held their gaze, Eleanor's and Frank's, for a long, suspended moment, so deep it seemed time itself had stopped. Then, with a regal poise that left them breathless, she turned and led her brood back into the desert. "She came to say goodbye," Eleanor whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. Frank slipped an arm around her, or maybe to say thank you. They never saw Luna again, though the bed remained on the porch and the water bowl was always kept full. Sometimes, in the stillness of morning, they would find paw prints pressed into the dust, proof that the desert's children still passed quietly through this place. They later welcomed a new dog, a shepherd mix they named Molly. But this time, they added a lock to the pet door and never forgot to secure it each night. The story of the bobcat that chose their home as its refuge gradually became a kind of legend among their close friends, retold again and again with embellishments and added details. But Eleanor and Frank kept one deeper truth to themselves, that for a brief and wondrous span of time, the boundary between human and wild had dissolved, revealing something rarer and more precious: trust, mutual respect, and a love that transcended species. In the end, that was the greatest lesson the desert had given them after all those years. That kindness, when offered freely and without condition, creates ripples that reach farther than the eye can see. Luna and her offspring now lived somewhere out there, carrying with them the memory of cool tile floors, a soft bed, and 2 aging humans who had opened their hearts to shelter them in their moment of need. And within Eleanor and Frank's home, where Shadow's collar still hung by the door, and an old bed still waited on the porch that memory lived on as well. A gentle reminder that sometimes, the deepest connections arrive from the most unexpected places, padding quietly into our lives on spotted paws, asking for nothing more than a moment of rest in a weary world.